One. This session will go until noon, right up to lunchtime. This session will be by Karl Ameriks, and he will present a paper called On Kant and the End of Theodicy.
Thank you. First, I'd just like to thank the people responsible, Mike and Sam, and the foundation that made this possible. I'm very honored to be here. Secondly, I have to apologize for a number of things. First, for some deep necessary laws. There's a law more deep than anything in Kant or Leibniz, which is that Kant and Leibniz meetings are at the same time always. So I have to leave right after this session and go to a Kant meeting. And I apologize, I won't be able to be part of the discussion, but I'll be looking at you all on the web sometime, I hope. Also apologize to some people here who may want to leave the room who've heard this earlier version of this paper, but it has a new purpose now because it fits in perfectly, in my view, with this morning's paper. So Professor Goldenbaum's paper is gives all the facts that are right in line with the more abstract things I'm saying on Kant, and I see it as two papers that are sort of saying very similar things, including about, for example, Kant's views on other religions and so forth, unfortunately. It's fairly long, so I'll just jump into it. The handout is for some, but not all, the quotations. Kant and the End of Theodicy, 5 parts. First part, prolegomena. There is a puzzle at the heart of Kant's religion within the boundaries of mere reason. Well, one more general remark. So it fits in this way that Kant's work, believe it or not, is very, very Leibnizian. He was very concerned with Leibniz all his life. He was very concerned with theodicy all his life. I'm going to focus on the late writings, but it's there from the beginning of his work. And the difference is he's concerned with philosophy of history, especially, as pointed out. And this has to do, I think, with his exposure primarily to Rousseau in his early work. But I will focus on the later text. So Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, Religion, is from 1793. And there are also related works in his discussion that I'll talk about, discussion of theodicy and the role of miracles. The puzzle is whether and how Kant's advocacy of the faith of a religion of reason, or Vernunftglaube, which appears to be largely motivated by anti-supernatural Enlightenment ideas of human progress, can itself be disentangled from an appeal to items that still seem miraculous, in a sense that is unnatural and unenlightened. I may not get to the 5th critical part where I say negative things about Kant, but that's the real point of the paper, believe it or not. Kant did not work out the complex theodicycal aspect of his conception of Vernunftglaube all at once. Its basic idea goes back decades, and Kant's late works contain a series of final fine-tunings that deserve close analysis. In addition to the 4 complex essays that constitute the Religion, there are several closely related 1780s essays on history, and at least half a dozen very relevant later essays. Taken together, these works constitute a final, bold attempt on Kant's part to shore up the Western teleological tradition in a way that is, all at once, deeply religious, liberal, scientific, and philosophically nuanced. Kant's attempt is also riddled with many problems, including theological conundrums, but I will leave those problems aside for the most part in order to focus on what I take to be the main philosophical puzzle arising from his treatment of the supernatural at the very end of parts 1 and 2 of the Religion. So, section 2, the puzzle. In a long second edition note added to the general remark at the end of the first of the 4 parts of the Religion, Kant makes explicit a theme common to each general remark that concludes a part of the book. Each general remark considers what Kant calls one of the 4 kinds of extravagant ideas that are peregra to pure moral religion, but understandably occur to reason as it reflects on its limitations in fulfilling our moral needs. These 4 kinds of ideas are neatly organized under the headings of, quote, effects of grace, miracles, mysteries, and means of grace. But the ideas are not at all on the same level, and determine exactly how they differ is no easy task. For our purposes, it will be enough to concentrate on an issue related to the contrast between ideas of the first two kinds. Even though Kant never explicitly denies the possibility of miracles, which he defines early on as items that interrupt the order of nature, as a quote, he understandably seems increasingly interested in strongly discouraging appeal to them, especially, but not only, as what he calls means of grace. With respect to mere effects of grace, however, it turns out to be difficult to make sense of Vernunftglaube's own central notion of religious hope without appealing to items that are at least somewhat like miracles. Here's quote 1a. As this general remark stresses, Vernunftglaube involves not only an initial moral effort on our part, but also hope that then, quote, what does not lie in our power will be made good by cooperation or Mitwirkung from above. The mention of Mitwirkung from above implies reference to some kind of effect of grace through special action upon us by a supernatural power. There are also several specifically theological conundrums here, but first, so I'll leave the grace part out for the most part, there's the basic philosophical challenge of finding a way in which Kant's invocation of any non-naturally based effect can be understood to be sufficiently unlike the superstitious reference to miracles that he heavily criticizes in Part 2 and other texts. One strategy for dispelling part, but only part of the problem, is to note that Kant distinguishes quite different ways of invoking ideas that go beyond ordinary nature, and he immediately adds explicit qualifications to his own reference to help from above. In the body of his first general remark, Kant stresses that Vernunftglaube, even in its most developed form, cannot claim to amount to conviction, Überzeugung, the strong epistemic attitude that comes with knowledge, or Wissen. And near the end of a long second edition note to this remark, Kant adds a stress on the point that even with Vernunftglaube, we can never summon, quote, any effects of grace by incorporating them in either a theoretical or practical maxim of reason. Kant may have felt a need to add this point, and perhaps the note as a whole, precisely because otherwise it might appear unclear whether, in regard to mere effects of grace, he has anything at least somewhat negative to say that would line up with the highly negative points about references to the supernatural that are stressed in other parts of the Religion. Nonetheless, essential to Vernunftglaube is religious hope, and essential to this hope is still some kind of positive, even if indeterminate, reference to some such effects. These effects must be thought of as more than simply not, as far as we know, impossible, for obviously such a weak thought could be had by all sorts of persons without faith of any sort. It's not necessary in this context to make more precise the status of Kantian hope as a specific epistemic attitude. Many people are working on this, and Andrew will fill you in later, I hope. What matters here is simply that there must be some kind of affirmative thought, some holding to be true about some special effect of the relevant sort, even though, as Kant repeatedly insists, this thought can never be absolutely certain or come with any explanatory insight or Einsicht. The main point I'll be stressing is that the perplexities just noted in the status of Vernunftglaube are also relevant to Kant's general notion, which was mentioned by Ursula in connection with the general Lutheran tradition, general notion of our absolute free agency, which is nothing less than the keystone concept of the critical philosophy. In the Religion, a positive reference to, quote, an effect of our free power of choice is the very starting point of the first general remark. And yet Kant repeatedly stresses that here too, we can have no insight into the how, or even an unqualified certainty about the that of such freedom. All we can say is that the assertion of effects of our freedom supposedly follows from, and only from, acceptance of something provocatively described as a fact of reason, Faktum der Vernunft. This is something taken to be, for each practical agent, a fundamental truth involving necessities, and hence it is called a matter of reason, but it is a non-demonstrable truth, and hence it, or at least our relation to it, is also called a kind of fact. This acceptance can also be described as the deed or tat of recognizing oneself as a moral being in a strict sense, very strict sense. It involves what Kant even calls a kind of moral certainty, but this is a form of certainty essentially qualified by the fact that it requires a first-person acknowledgement of the non-natural demands of Kant's strict moral perspective, categorical imperative. Kant's endorsement of absolute freedom is, to be sure, not completely on a par with his endorsement of the hope involved in Vernunftglaube. His analysis of hope has built into it a presumption of the endorsement of freedom, whereas the mere analysis of our moral freedom does not by itself entail the more complex commitment to religious hope and its implications. Nonetheless, in Kant's system, the perplexing thought of our freedom still seems relevantly enough like the perplexing thought of effects of grace, insofar as both thoughts essentially invoke a non-natural ground of empirical effects and do so in ways that are said to go beyond anything about which we can claim insight or unqualified certainty. Hence, even prior to Kant's carefully worded endorsement of the possible affirmation of the complex second-order effects of an external higher freedom acting upon us in grace in response to our Vernunftglaube, there's already the more general interpretive puzzle of explaining the deep asymmetry between, on the one hand, Kant's negative attitude toward affirming any specific miracles, and on the other hand, his carefully worded but frequent affirmation of effects of our own first-order, everyday, absolute freedom. The issue of miracles dominates Kant's general remark to the Religion's second part, and its critical tone is set in its very first sentence, which proclaims that after the enlightened spread of Vernunftglaube, quote, faith in miracles eventually will be rendered, quote, in general dispensable. This remark does not declare miracles non-existent, let alone impossible, but it can be read as philosophically allowing the notion of them merely, as for all we know, bare logical possibility, one that has played an understandable but temporary role earlier in history simply because of a lack of adequate education. A complication here is the fact that because of matters having to do with very sensitive church-state issues at the time, Kant's Religion is especially concerned with arguments against the notion of making public commitment to miracles a test of faith and ministerial certification. This focus on the political aspect of the issue should not distract one from noticing that Kant is also very opposed to the thought that faith requires any sort of private belief in miracles, because the enlightened requirements of Vernunftglaube must be of a sort that are in principle open to being satisfied by all human beings simply on the basis of their original full rational equipment. There is a kind of public condition, a condition of real universal access on what can even be expected to need, on what one can even be expected to need to believe or affirm privately. This condition is taken to rule out requiring, for genuine internal faith, any appeal to a special experience of the miraculous, that is, any strictly local and historical event. Because a miracle, whether great or little, past or present, rare or repeated, must be thought of as a particular event said to be accessed under unusual conditions that seem essentially inconsistent with the whole order of, quote, worldly events. It is therefore also for Kant something that cannot be fairly expected to be affirmed by persons as such, permitted but not expected, wherever they are, for this would violate the principle of rational autonomy. At the end, or my fifth section is about the thought that the universal accessibility aspect of this principle has significant and apparently unforeseen negative consequences for Kant's own position. Kant's language in the Religion attempts to dance around the issue exactly how to talk about miracles and the non-natural without being either offensive to his readers or untrue to his own religious concerns and critical perspective. This perspective, again, cannot, of course, ever absolutely exclude non-natural sources for anything, and such sources are by no means a far-fetched option for Kant. He points out himself that even with respect to, and this is quote 1b, phenomena obeying, important quote, natural laws, the critical philosophy must, quote, renounce cognition of that which brings about effects according to these laws in itself, or must renounce cognition of that in itself which brings about effects according to these laws. Given transcendental idealism, that is, it follows that in principle we can have no insight into the things in themselves that ultimately do the genuine bringing about that goes beyond whatever we can know in terms of the relational principles governing spatial temporal phenomena. To use a distinction from the solution to the third antinomy of the first critique, A533, one could say that Kant is happy to affirm insight into causes as natural relations, but his idealism makes him leave the ultimate causality of a cause, not theoretically knowable by us. Kant adds in Religion that a similar point applies in the context of our own self and its attempt at moral improvement, where we, quote, have no understanding of how to distinguish with certainty non-natural influences from natural ones. And so, for all we know, quote, heavenly influences might cooperate here and be necessary in an ultimate, but to us inaccessible, explanatory way. In alluding to something beyond both external and internal phenomena, Kant is, I presume, not making a merely hypothetical statement, but is referring to some non-spatial temporal ground, some I know not what, that he's obliged to assert that exists. At the same time, he has to say that we cannot determine specifically what it is, beyond the very general characterization of it as whatever allows for experience and the fulfillment of our moral agency. For this reason, in addition to criticizing Lavater, the main advocate at the time of appeal to miracles, Kant reiterates in a second edition footnote the first part's key claim that no appeal to miracles is ever to be brought into our theoretical or practical maxims. Here, Kant does mention something loosely called a theistic miracle, that's a quote, but it's important that this is only, quote, and this maybe should be an extra on the handout, but it's not, this theistic miracle is only, quote, a general concept of a creator and ruler of the world according to the order of nature. And so for Kant, this is precisely not the common concept of a miracle as an event that is within the world, but contrary to the order of nature. With respect to God's particular effects, beyond assuming that they would never violate theoretical or moral reason, Kant insists that our reason cannot even, quote, ever hope to be instructed in the world. In a final footnote to this remark, Kant speaks of how events that strike us as highly unusual are only so-called miracles of nature. They should not be presumed to be genuine miracles, for this would only confuse and deject our reason, and we would then even have to worry that all our supposedly moral thoughts may also be driven into us in some miraculous way. Unusual events normally are, and should be, he says, taken to be occasions for nourishing reason and the theoretical, quote, hope of discovering new laws of nature. And here's another, another quote on the sheet. Kant dismisses worries that we have no cognition of what he calls the cause of gravity, the ultimate cause, for we do have cognition of the laws of these forces, sufficient for regressive employment in the ordering of experiences under them. In his final sentence to this footnote, and part two as a whole, Kant responds directly to those who pretend to have insight into how the very complex natural developments that come with every return of spring, some places, are a matter of the immediate influence, quote, immediate influence of the Creator. Against this pretense, Kant dramatically proclaims, quote, but these are experiences, Erfahrungen, for us. Therefore, they are nothing but effects of nature and ought never to be judged otherwise, end of quote. And he closes by saying that to accept this point is the true modesty of reason in contrast to the false humility of invoking miracles. The appeal here to the notion of Erfahrung is, of course, or experience, is not a matter of crude phenomenalism, representationalist empiricism, I think, but a constant reminder of the common sense factum underlying his entire critical system, which is a structured and cognitive domain, and one that turns out to be law-governed in a very strict way without any reference to miraculous interventions. The fact that Kant stresses the words for us and ought is also an implicit reminder of another aspect of what he means by reason's modesty, namely that he's speaking only about what our maxims should be for making determinate claims, and he does not go so far as to make any absolute denials beyond these maxims. All the same, I take his vivid language to be a clear indication that his point is roughly, and here I invent a quote, he's saying, as it were, of course it's possible to try to introduce miracles in nature, but a rational person merely as such should not do so, given where we do in fact stand with our well-structured domain of experience or Erfahrung. That is, Kant's tone indicates, albeit indirectly, that we can read, I believe, as sarcasm, his earlier sentences in the text proper, which allow, and this is quote 1d, that it might well be that Jesus' appearance on earth, as well as his translation from it, his eventual life and his passion, are all but miracles. Indeed, that the history that ought to testify to the account of these miracles is itself a miracle. I think he's saying that with a Humean smirk. The suggestion that once one starts on this path, one might as well introduce all sorts of further miracles implies, I think, that Kant has lost sympathy with affirming any particular miraculous works. But this again still leaves us with the critical question of whether one might not respond similarly to Kant's own approach and argue that as soon as one introduces any effects with non-natural causes or sources, as he still does, then one might as well be more open to other literally non-natural things, such as miracles too. Now, section 3, which I call Critique of Pure Wonder. This point is not a matter of casual interest for Kant, for he repeatedly stresses another way of speaking that plays off the language of miracles, but gives it a critical twist. Quote 2a. The first general remark links Kant's central notion of a revolution in our way of thinking, as in the new creation, that's a quote, of a person with Vernunftglaube, with the attitude of what he calls proper admiration, Bewunderung, for virtuous actions. In the German edition, it's impossible to miss Kant's main point here. Kant's aim is to substitute for reference to Wunder, that is literal miracles, a supposedly much more modest reference to Bewunderung, that is a common deep sense of amazed admiration with regard to examples of committing one's life to respect for the moral law. This key terminological point of the Religion is anticipated in Kant's just slightly earlier essay on Theodicy, which uses the term Bewunderung, in a rare reference to the Hebrew Bible, to describe the proper reaction to the story of Job. Kant takes this story to teach us to respect the primacy of pure morality and sincerity, as opposed to any pretense of being able to discern specific actions of God in the world as specially intended punishments. Although the essay is perhaps best known for its title reference to a miscarriage or failure of theodicies, Kant's basic point there is rather that although one cannot expect speculative philosophy to show how the world actually does serve God's purposes, this is consistent with accepting what he calls authentic theodicy, which takes proper service to God to rely basically on accepting the absolute primacy of pure morality. So the end, in the sense of limitation, or last phase, or defeat of traditional theodicy, is thus for Kant only the beginning, and is to lead to the goal or purpose or victory of what he takes to be the genuinely theodicycal attitude, the pure moral attitude. That this kind of discussion of miracles is very important for Kant is also clear from the fact that it is emphasized again in his very last and very carefully composed essay, The Conflict of the Faculties. His discussion occurs in the first part of the text, a section, as far as I know, was given an English translation only in 1979, and this translation, again, weakens the intended contrast, I think, by simply using the term wonder and not noting explicitly the sharp distinction for Kant between mere Bewunderung and literal Wunder, or miracles. This is quote 2b. The general remark in this part of the conflict is devoted to the advocacy of our moral metamorphosis in a pure religious revolution that would take us beyond all sectarianism. Kant goes out of his way here explicitly to reject the recourse to miracles by traditional pietists and Moravians, and then he turns immediately to the, quote, something in us that we cannot cease to wonder at, bewunder and admire, namely the moral law that, quote, lies objectively in the natural order of things as the object of pure reason. Kant speaks here of our höchsten Bewunderung, which he italicizes, and he also repeatedly uses a verb form of the term. For reasons that will also be noted later, Kant contrasts the appreciation of what he here calls the supersensible, not the supernatural, but the supersensible practical law that is in us, that is contained in our nature as lawful beings of reason, with the greatly mistaken move of those who are, quote, led to consider it supernatural, that is, to regard it as the influence of another and higher spirit. The repeated use of the term revolution, and there are going to be 5 phases of revolution, I count. Jovel has a book where he talks about 2 or 3 revolutions in Kant, but there are many more, or sub-revolutions. This could go on. The term revolution in Religion is clearly meant to resonate at a number of authentic theodicycal levels at once. In addition to the revolution discussed first, simply in terms of each individual person's conversion to pure morality, Kant claims repeatedly that there is, secondly, a related general revolution within, quote, the human race, one that was inaugurated, although not completed, by the Gospels. Kant goes so far as to say that the innovative moral attitude of the teacher of the Gospels, he doesn't use the word Jesus, he says teacher of the Gospels, fundamentally excels, this is a quote, fundamentally excels anything found in prior philosophy, and that the revolutionary ideal that defines it and is exemplified in stories of the teacher's life is the major source behind the ultimate direction of all subsequent history. It quietly spreads everywhere. This ideal introduces, quote, a realm in which nobody is therefore slave, for, quote, by exemplifying that principle in the moral ideal, that human being opened the doors of freedom to all. 682. The main theme of part 2 of the Religion, and especially of the subpart concerned with the personified good and the objective reality of the ideal present in the Gospels of being pleasing to God, is that a relation back to this very ideal as an ideal model rather than an external miraculous fact is what is crucial for each individual's moral revolution in modern life. In addition, Kant links such modern individual revolutions forward to the new ideal of an autonomous social realm, one whose success he anticipates because of the effects of a recent philosophical development. Kant understands this development to have been generated by the explicit appeal to the idea of autonomy, that is, freedom and human action that's rationally lawful, emphasized in what he calls, quote, the genius of Rousseau's work that can itself be called a third kind of critical revolution. For this work literally turned around the direction of Kant's own thought in the 1760s, away from Wolffianism, broadly speaking. And so it's no accident that the very beginning of the Religion links the theme of modern reborn optimism to Rousseau's awareness of, quote, the seed, the chyme of goodness, the seed, and humanity as such. According to what's called the Collins Lectures, Kant held that, quote, many have maintained that in man there are no seeds of good, only of evil, and Rousseau alone preaches the opposite. So Rousseau's revolutionary philosophical achievement is to begin to turn cultivated modern humanity away at a level that is itself reflective and literary from the special problem of its absolutization of the life of luxury and scientific preoccupation, which was Kant's own attitude right up to this point in the 1760s, just as the Gospels began to turn naive ancient humanity away, supposedly, at a level that is itself religious and exemplary from the obsession with mere priestly trappings and superstition that Kant, having read Semler, takes to define the surrounding pre-Christian world. The last two parts of Religion, along with other late essays related to it, fill out Kant's revolutionary narrative by taking the enthusiastic affirmative response of common people throughout Europe then, in their unselfish sympathy toward the basic anti-elitist ideal of the French Revolution, to be a, quote, irreversible sign of humanity's entrance into the political antechamber of history's final era, and thus to constitute a critical revolution in a fourth and more concrete sense. This sign bolsters Kant's own hope that individual moral revolutions will be combined more and more with republican, in the old sense, and peaceful political reformation, and that an enlightened, invisible church will move humanity as a species asymptotically toward an earthly realization of the Theodicy of Vernunftglaube. Within this last phase, works such as Kant's own critical system and Enlightenment essays, as well as similar works by allies such as Reinhold, can be understood as intended to be part of what I would call yet a fifth and final revolution, the late modern systematic historical turn inaugurated by Kant's critique. This work aims at perpetually securing, at a meta level, the insights of Christianity's and Rousseau's moral visions, as well as those of common humanity and the fans of the French Revolution, by solidly protecting them from future contamination ever by dogmatic or naive misunderstandings. Kant's use of the term Bewunderung is therefore hardly casual. It's clearly positioned in a place that is central to his multi-stage theodicyclical account of how a pure moral religion is supposed to wean modern society through various interlocking revolutions away from appealing to miracles toward that supernatural beings, or insisting that supernatural beings are literally part of human history. The puzzle remains, however, that at the same time that Kant works out a progressive Enlightenment view of society and history, he continues to make what can now seem, to many of us, to be extraordinarily immodest, non-natural remarks of his own about how all human beings can believe in really being able to work absolutely freely toward the highest good. Kant admits right from the start that each step in his multi-stage epic of freedom rests on non-sensible factors that concern our inner being, but whose operation is, quote, absolutely inexplicable, schlechte Dinge unerklärlich, that's quote 2c, to us. In the end, the hopeful attitude of Vernunftglaube earns its name as a kind of faith, for a convinced Kantian must affirm nothing less than a very substantive three-part creed, sort of a trinity here, that existence on the whole is a teleologically ordered complex of, first, a natural sphere that is fully law-governed, although not by itself moral or with any miraculous interventions, and second, a moral sphere that is also law-governed in its own way, but not itself either sensible or literally miraculous, and yet is such that, third, all the non-natural features just reviewed fit together amazingly, marvelously, so that the laws of morality also turn out to govern the general shape of the laws of the natural world and world history. This final position is so ambitious that it hardly can be given a convincing quick defense. At best, one can find first ways to try to understand its origins and status relative to other directly relevant positions. So part 4 is just hermeneutical hypothesis about some of the backgrounds of this view. Kant's Theodicy then implies not only a very expansive teleological conception of each of the cosmological and moral orders by themselves, but also a very strong commitment to their tight linkage. It is precisely these two orders that are referenced, you'll recall, in the most famous of all passages in Kant's works, namely the Second Critique's comment about our ever-increasing Bewunderung und Ehrfurcht, amazement and awe, you might say, with regard to the starry heavens above and the moral law within. What this comment should remind us of now is not so much the individual features of these two contrasting sources of our amazed admiration and awe, but rather the fact that this text connects them in one grand statement, a statement that can be taken as a clue that, from the very start in Kant's mind, these orders are much more closely related than contemporary readers may tend to assume. It's true, of course, that after his early 1760s turn to Rousseau and his dramatic realization that the distinctive fulfillment of the human species concerns our practical rather than exclusively theoretical capacities, Kant frequently contrasts the determined theoretical order of nature with the pure practical order of absolute freedom. Nonetheless, after this turn, Kant also insists that reason is unified, and he eventually sees that theoretical philosophy must find a systematic way, namely transcendental idealism, to allow metaphysical room for practical reason to be an absolute free source of effects, despite all that the critical philosophy entails about nature as a strictly lawful spatial temporal order. The key move here in Kant's practical philosophy is his Rousseauian abandonment of the notion, which he held earlier, that freedom must come with lawlessness, and his development instead of a conception of what he calls our nature as free beings, a nature that like all natures, in his terminology, is governed by a law, in this case, the moral law. As been noted above, this is an order that Kant sometimes prefers to call supersensible, übersinnlich, rather than supernatural, despite its definitely non-empirical character. This is because the supersensible is not in every sense non-natural. The reason why there's a sense in which the term nature is very appropriate here for the supersensible as moral is that for Kant, the term nature has a more general sense that's not limited to the physical realm and can signify the law-governed structure of a concrete item of whatever kind, in this case, our moral being. In this broad sense, for Kant, nature is not entirely opposed to grace, for there is a moral nature that defines the distinct system of prescriptive laws governing concrete rational beings in general, and that is formally similar to the descriptive law-governed structure of physical beings as such, even though this moral nature, and it alone at its deepest level, is also determined by essentially teleological rather than merely mechanical principles. Kant's notion of our lawful moral nature underlies his cosmopolitan idea of the special practical telos of the human species. According to this idea of reason, which is distinct from but closely connected to the purely metaphysical ideas with a capital I, of Kant's postulates of pure practical reason, we are to believe that there's an underlying theodicycal pattern within human history such that legal and political developments will eventually lead to conditions that make possible the fulfillment of our sublime moral human history. Scholars such as Paul Guyer and Eric Watkins have already traced many of the intricate complexities of Kant's account of how his overarching critical conception of purposive moral order coheres with his full theoretical account of nature and his entire system of philosophy. Work along this line helps us to see that there's an underlying unity to Kant's work, worked out in most detail in the Third Critique, and to appreciate that its interconnected account of aesthetics and physical nature is meant to be completed by and not merely juxtaposed with references to a supersensible that is moral ground for all existence that alone gives human life a genuinely meaningful purpose. This is not a new point, but what has perhaps not been appreciated enough yet is all the evidence that Kant's unified view of freedom and nature and of the human and the divine order is not a late addition to his thought, but an elliptical return to his very early and most basic, even if temporarily obscured, convictions, as say obscured when he got, in his early career, obsessed with just doing mathematics, physics, and kind of Wolffian, Leibnizian metaphysics. The hermeneutical guiding thread or leitfaden, I think, that reveals the unity behind Kant's long-term vision goes back to what seems to be his very earliest philosophical experience, when, according to Jachmann's account of, in his old age, of Kant's frequent recollections, his devout mother took her young children out to the edge of town at night so they could see all the more clearly from a point not very far from Copernicus's home, the, quote, power, wisdom, and goodness of the creator of all things in the stars of the northern European sky. Jachmann's account seems genuine and especially relevant since it links a reference to the mother's awakening and appreciation of the, quote, impressions of nature with a mention of, quote, the seed, the keim of goodness, a phrase that we've seen plays a key role throughout Kant's work on religion and our moral nature. A very similar linking of the natural and moral orders can be found in the cosmology section of the 1782 Metaphysics Mongrovius. That's quote 4b. I think I'll just skip that. That's on the sheet there. It was only when Kant was almost 40 years old, and after many years of studying the impressions of nature in a scientific way, that he came back through the close study of Rousseau's moral writings in 1763-64 to begin to concentrate on the seed and destiny of our nature in a primarily moral sense. These have just been translated in the full version in English in the Cambridge edition that came out, I think, last year. That's one reason why I like to emphasize them for sales. So it was with Rousseau's moral writings in 1763-64 that he began to concentrate in his marginal comments. So the marginal comments are really not comments on the beautiful and the sublime. They're really comments on Rousseau, and they give you the whole moral philosophy that he has, but that he never published to the groundwork 20 years later, but he was lecturing on all the time. That gives it to you there in a nutshell. So then he began to concentrate on the seed and destiny of our nature in a primarily moral sense with a specific law of its own. And even before that time, however, in the first 2 decades of Kant's career, I'll remind you it's a significant fact that he regularly added remarks about design, development, and divinity in his natural philosophy. His early essays on metaphysics and the natural history of the universe are composed on the presumption that there is an evident overarching teleological unity to the universe, one that redounds all the more appropriately to the Creator's wisdom and goodness, because it does not need to appeal, as he feared Newtonianism or occasionalism does, to repeated miracle-like interventions or acts of support by the deity. And here's quote 4c. In the Beweisgrund of 1763, which is, I think, just before the Rousseau turn, Kant still makes a twofold theoretical teleological claim, namely that one, different natural effects are, in respect to their beauty and goodness, usefulness, to be subsumed under the essential order of nature. It's kind of like transcendental philosophy later. And by that means as subsumed under what he calls here God as the divine architect. And two, many arrangements will be subsumed under an order of nature which is contingent in character and the product of artifice, and in virtue of that subsumption, they will also be subsumed, he says, then under God. In his critical work, Kant gives up taking these teleological claims to be a demonstrable theoretical proposition, and he provides a new moral ground for it, but it's very striking that even in his earlier work, he is concerned above all with conceiving a tight, overarching order of God, humanity, and nature all at once, with no need for interruption anywhere by miraculous events. Although at this point, Kant still speaks of a system that can do without the assistance of frequent miracles, that's the Beweisgrund 2.109, what's most significant here is that he dares to go so far as explicitly to challenge Newton, who he takes to have proposed that a miraculous intervention was needed to prevent the universe from falling back into a quote, state of complete stagnation. It's typical of Kant's firm theodistical attitude that he goes on to argue that, and this is like the multiverse issue maybe, he goes on to argue that whatever our local problems, we can use our cosmological imagination to postulate that the universe can still have, quote, great fruitfulness elsewhere. In this way, we can still maintain a fully teleological and yet seamlessly natural conception of the mundane sphere as an externally massive whole governed in a non-interventionist manner by an all-encompassing, purposeful design. This section of the Beweisgrund also bears a close relation to Kant's 1784 idea for universal history, which was mentioned earlier. Both discussions focus on the seeming indeterminacy that arises from actions that, quote, harbor within themselves a possibility of deviating from the good. And both discussions call attention to the statistical laws that apply even to human actions that may appear significantly free, such as marriage choices. In the Beweisgrund, to be sure, Kant still speaks sometimes without direct reservations about, quote, immediate divine intervention and revelation at specific times and among specific nations. That's 2.111. It is very significant, therefore, that in his otherwise parallel discussions in the 1780s and after, Kant does not speak in this way, and he instead stresses that endorsing rare miracles is just as questionable as referring to frequent ones. But although this is an important change in explicit language, it can also be taken as a natural development of strands already in Kant's thought in the 1760s, for even the Beweisgrund ends its discussion by saying, quote, 4d, quote, I should find it amazing if anything occurred or could occur in the course of nature in need of a miracle to improve it. This might be what he would say about Lisbon and the earthquakes. You just got to have all these complications, even tornadoes or so forth. You know, the world's a complicated place. These things happen. In need of a miracle to improve it. And were such an event to occur, it would be utterly incomprehensible to us. In other words, something outside of the regular course of nature. In addition, Kant already uses roughly the same example here as in the dramatic culmination of his discussion at the end of the second part of the Religion, namely the amazing regenerative fruitfulness of plants and animals, to argue against the other scientific leader of the age, Buffon, that there's no need to refer to, quote, 4c, immediate divine action, for one must concede to the things of nature a possibility greater than that which is commonly conceded of producing their effects in accordance with universal laws. Given this attitude, it's not surprising that even prior to the critical turn as such, or what's called the critical turn, Kant's 1770 dissertation ends with a section that proposes as a first rule of judging that, quote, all things in the universe take place in accordance with the order of nature, and hence comparative miracles such as the influence of spirits are carefully excluded from the explanation of phenomena. In his metaphysics lectures, Kant explains that a comparative miracle would be an event that seems supernatural in relation to our reason, but can still occur, quote, according to certain laws unknown to us. And therefore, to speak of miracles in this extended sense is still not to concede that there are miracles strictly speaking. But the most revealing point might be that Kant makes here is when he adds that a miracle is not, quote, something of which we do not cognize the cause, and he means that because we never know the ultimate causes of things, but rather that of which we do not cognize the laws. So that's why morality is not so miraculous because there are laws for it. Thus, magnetic power is no miracle, for we cognize the law, but not the ultimate cause. Let's quote 4F. I take this to be an extremely significant qualification because it suggests that the distinction between law and cause here, in the sense of the ultimate causing, may be the main reason that Kant believed he could regard our own absolute freedom and even all its theodicycal involvement with the moral existence of God and nature as not miraculous. This is because even if we can't literally know the ultimate causings at work here, we still do grasp the law of their operation, which in this case is moral. And so in that sense, we're not going beyond nature in its most fundamental meaning, which is simply to be lawful. There's a second point that's important here. Kant conceives of our free action as not only lawful, but also internally grounded in a number of important but distinct senses, and that I think are sometimes misunderstood. Insofar as our action is normatively guided by the moral law, and insofar as Kant regards this law as internal to the structure of our own pure practical reason, there's a sense in which a moral agent is following something within its own self. That is not its merely individual and psychological self, but rather its general nature as a being of pure practical reason. This internal aspect is significant here because it implies for Kant that ultimately our action is normatively guided in a sense from within, that is analogously to formal causation, and is not to be thought of as guided by an external, that is heteronymous and ad hoc principle, such as either mere feelings or physical or historical principles, or even God thought of as arbitrarily instructing us by using authority grounded in mere miraculous power. Moreover, in a second metaphysical causal sense, it's also true that, insofar as we take ourselves to be an ultimate subject, then each of our actions has an internal efficient source, but now in the very different sense of resting primarily in our concrete individuality as such. Here too, this source, even if not omnipotent, is to be thought of as independent in its original direction of any external, that is ad hoc force, such as either mere feelings or physical or historical forces, or even God thought of as arbitrarily interrupting us by using miraculous power. Might supplement our work, but not interrupt our work, we hope. Our most detailed indication of Kant's views on God's metaphysical relation to us come from some not clearly trustworthy notes to lectures on philosophical theology from the 1780s. These are still a little mysterious to me. They're after the first critique, but they're not to students who could buy and read the first critique, but they're not quite in accord with it, sometimes it seems. These notes discuss problems in conceiving either a natural concursus of God with the world in general, or a moral concursus, these are his terms, with us as individual free agents. With respect to the world, God takes each substance to rest entirely in God for its existence, so in that respect, God alone is sufficient, and there's no need for the thought of a concursus. With respect to the states of mundane things, however, Kant indicates that each previous natural state is by itself sufficient for the effect, and so here too, although for an opposite reason, there is no need for the thought of a concursus. This is volume 28, 1106. Similarly, with respect to our freedom, Kant notes that our absolutely free choice is sufficient in its own realm, so here again it would seem that no literal concursus is to be introduced. It is noted that we cannot rule out that in some, quote, not in the least conceivable way, God might concur with us here, but the notes, like the Religion, also indicate that eventually such special causings could be multiplied arbitrarily, endlessly, and absurdly, and this would lead to the conclusion, quote, what imperfection in such a world, totally irreconcilable with a wise author. I take this to mean that although hypothetically we might speak in general terms of what he calls, quote, a miracle of the moral world, just as, he says, quote, God's acts of cooperation with occurrences in the sensible world are God's miracles in the physical world. I think what he means is that God, if you believe that God exists as he does, then God's behind the physical world too. But all this seems to imply that actually for Kant, we should not go so far as to affirm any particular interventions in the order that we know. This is not to deny, however, that with respect to the general complex achievement of the highest good, there still is a sense in which Kant could think of ourselves and God in a kind of concursum moralem, a phrase from 28:11:10, because this highest good is precisely a joint arrangement. combined a project. It requires free agents to fit properly together with an amenable overall environment independent of them, and hence whatever is ultimately responsible for that environment must also play a role in making the end possible. In sum, Kant can, after all, consistently conceive his extremely elaborate theodistical teleology as not literally involving miracles, because insofar as it is defined by the thought of beings, human, subhuman, superhuman, that are always ultimately acting in a way that fits together with a fully purposeful set of internally determined laws, there is no assertion of special acts or exceptions imposed on the order of nature in the broadest sense, thus including our nature, God's nature, and the nature of the physical and moral world on the whole. I think I'll just cut the critical concluding caveat. Don't want to be negative at the end. Just want to get your questions.
Okay, someone in the back. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. Yep. The question I have is that you laid quite stress on Vernunftglaube.
Yeah.
And in the essay on the miscarriage of philosophical theodicy, I think he refers to it as a Glaubenssache. And I'm assuming that it's the same belief that he's talking about there.
He does abbreviate it sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. My question is that the moral faith seems to me to depend on the success of his practical postulations in the second critique, and his reliance on the concept of the inability to get hold of the highest good in this world. So what I wanted to ask you was, to what extent, if any, do you share the doubts about the highest good doctrine as effectively undermining Vernunftglaube and leaving the whole thing in a complete state of flux?
Thanks. I'm glad you asked that. I have kind of a strange view on that. So at the end of the paper, the questions I raise have to do just simply with the notion of free agency. I'm not against libertarianism at all, but I have suspicions of it being as, obviously rational and so forth, universally acceptable, since it's such a contentious doctrine. But he seems to treat it as commonsensical practically. But on what you mentioned, the highest good, which is often taken to be this extra complicated thing, I tend to say other things because my view is that Kant's position here is very interesting, because I actually think that most what I would call progressivists, people that have gone even beyond Kant, as it were, or the more metaphysical side of Kant, or just wild and crazy Marxists or whatever, my friends, often, I think they have to buy into this. So my thought, partially inspired by Bob Adams' old article on Kant's moral argument, my thought is that if, as a lot of these people, where they are, if they take nature as we know it, it's just irrational to think we're going in a progressive direction. And we may be all doomed by our genes to be nasty to each other for the rest of eternity. It's a pretty good induction. So I think you have to believe in something extra that's non-natural in some sense. Kant's got a kind of complicated machinery for the highest good, but I think there's a parallel to his thought of the highest good that's sort of necessary for all progressivist thought, and there's a little bit of a bad faith in not facing up to it. So that's if I had another section, that's the way I would go on that one, though I'm perfectly sensitive to what you're mentioning, as I think referring to certain little problems in the argument as such, not completely compelling in a deductive sense and so forth. Thank you.
Catherine.
Thanks. For years we were all taught, even in graduate courses, that Kant's view of teleology was strictly heuristic, no substantive commitment, or that it was just a kind of pragmatic defense against moral nihilism that we were obligated to adopt. But no serious student of Kant believes that anymore. The commitment is obviously very substantive, and these notions of Keime and Entwicklung are very, very fundamental. Do you think this has more to do with Kant's oscillations, pre-critical, critical, post-critical, or indecision? Or do you think it was the fact that commentators wanted to make Kant seem more contemporary, more like us? And
Oh, yeah,
we
yeah.
don't believe in that.
Right, no, it's not. So I think there's a, it always depends what audience I'm speaking to. So at Notre Dame, I presume the metaphysics is not so unfamiliar, but in most other places, you have to sort of stress that there are these other broader contexts going on, because a lot of places don't want teleology or metaphysics or just a general worldview introduced at all. But that's our hang up or whatever. But Kant is very much into these views from the beginning, and I think very consistently so. So I would just say in reading and researching for the last couple of years, this has really hit me, every day. And so this is a chapter from a book called Kant's Elliptical Path, meaning that he's coming back to views which, on the one hand, the moral views were expressed in the 1760s, but the broader teleological vision goes back to, the quotes from Pope and all these people, in the universal natural history, which is a history with a teleological structure and so forth. So it's just in him from the very beginning, and the era and so forth. And how could we be so blind? Yeah, he keeps on. Yeah, it's old people go back to what they believed when they were very young sometimes. I don't know if consistently, but.
Andrew.
Thanks. I'm curious, a lot of questions, but one question would be about your quotation F star under 4.
Yeah.
You probably know the other one where he says that miracles are those things of which we can cognize neither the laws nor the effects, which is much more puzzling because you'd think we do.
Oh, but I have an answer on that one.
The effects you do? Okay.
Well, it's that we can't cognize them as the effects of something that's caused, so it's,
Right, okay.
that's the trick.
So we see the Red Sea
Right,
parting, we just don't cognize
As the
it.
effect
Yeah.
of, right?
But here you wanted to say this isn't just a principle regarding kind of physical nature, empirical nature, but that we can also think of this as something we can apply to moral nature. And so we could say it's not a miracle because we do cognize the laws, we cognize the moral law. And I guess I'm wondering whether there's not a worry about an implication regarding God. So suppose you believe in God, and suppose you take Kant seriously when he says that what it is to believe in God is also to believe that God's commands are the moral law. Then it looks as though we cognize the moral law, so we're cognizing God's freedom in some sense, God's free choices. And so divine will or freedom becomes something non-miraculous. Is that a problem?
Well, I take the other view on that although there's some sense, a rhetorical sense in calling these divine commands, I read Kant as regarding the moral laws as kind of fixed independently of God's will. So there's not like a God causing the moral laws or anything like that. So in that sense, the problem wouldn't arise if you take that reading.
Right. But there's still a sense in which what God's doing, not voluntaristic, he's not willing the moral law, but there's still a sort of infelicity in saying because we cognize the moral law and God is also going to follow the moral law, there's a sense in which divine freedom is no longer in any way miraculous.
Well, divine freedom wouldn't be miraculous in that context, but there could be other ways, supererogatory ways in which God could do extra stuff, right? So the commands are kind of like any pure rational being is to be thought this way, but God's got like extra time. And
Supererogation for God.
well, I'm not going to rule it out, being held to account often on these things.
Susan.
A couple of points just to Andrew's last remark. Kant says very clearly that the moral law is above God. He says it in a couple of examples, right? Where one is with the binding of Isaac. If you hear a voice telling you to do that, you know it can't be God. So he says that over and over. I think it's important to note that. But I'm more concerned with a general point, and I may be in a minority here, I deeply agree with you that Kant is concerned with theodicy from the very beginning. One of my favorite pieces of evidence for that is the wonderful remark where he calls Rousseau the Newton of the mind, because he answers the objections of King Alfonso and the Manichaeans, which sent me looking to find out who King Alfonso was, who's also, of course, comes up with Bayle and Leibniz and so on. But I am much less convinced, I guess, than the two of you that he doesn't develop this into a quite different view by the end of his life through Rousseau. That is, I don't think he needs, I don't think we have to choose between, oh, it's merely heuristic and let's not take it seriously, and no, he's a really hardcore teleologist and it has to be, all somehow in nature. I think the best evidence for that comes in a passage from the Streiterfakultäten that you didn't mention, where he talks about history and what he takes to be a sign of progress. And I think he actually comes to a wonderful move, again, deeply influenced by Rousseau, which doesn't go as far as Hegel does, okay? Progress isn't, it's not necessary, but it's possible. And he refers to the disinterested view we take in the success of the French Revolution, which is an incredibly minimalistic criterion of progress. So I wonder if you could say anything about that, because I do think there's a move between the 2 points in the room we've been
Well, I was sort of referring to that a little bit when I talked about the enthusiasm for the French Revolution. So there are these signs that he gives I think you're right, he gives a kind of indeterminate epistemological status. So, in terms of where we stand now, do we see signs of the big teleology? Well, what the best we see is signs. He also says the same thing. He has a similar passage I would take to be a passage about a similar problem when he talks about not external history, but our own personal history. And, one way of looking at it would be, you better not talk about the ultimate teleology of yourself. Are you getting better or worse? But he says, oh, no, I mean, and I do think he's got this general view. This may be hard to believe, but I think his general view is, if you've got some kind of common sense suppositions to say such and such, then, as long as the Kantian metaphysics doesn't rule it out, go with it. So, he says, well, if you seem to be having to be looking back on yourself for a long time, you seem to be developing in a slightly better way. Despite all the other things he says, you don't have to backtrack on that and say, well, I may be becoming a devil rather than not. So there are these indeterminate, weaker kind of teleological claims that we can make about what's around us, and I think he does.
Well, the question is whether they're weaker or whether they actually have an independent status. And I know that it's often been interpreted as if they were weaker, but I think there's an argument to be made for the fact that they're something quite different than either merely heuristic or kind of closet teleology.
Well, again, I'm distinguishing. I want to say what he's talking about is structures that would, in themselves, be very teleological, but our knowledge of them is, or stays with respect to how strongly we affirm them, is sort of in between. It's not like morality or something like you've got to have a conviction about, but something you can say, well, most likely I think it's like this. That's the thought. And I don't have to be, the main thing is, what he's really worried about, the whole history essay is all about, should we be negative? And the thought is, here are reasons for, it's okay to be somewhat positive, but don't get too positive. But he says the same thing about morality. A famous thing he says about morality is he says, people think he's keen on morality, but he says the worst kind of fanatic is the moral fanatic. That, you shouldn't get too, just because you think there's a moral law. People who believe in the moral law are most likely to do the worst harm, he says at certain times. So he does have a lot of qualifications on things that he believes are very strongly true, if that helps at all.
Colin.
Thanks, Karl. So I have a question about free action.
Okay.
And so I liked your story about why free action, though very weird in Kant, does not count as a miracle, because it's normatively guided by the moral law. And I'm wondering, well, what do we say when I fall short of the categorical imperative?
You.
But is that guided by a law or governed by a law, or is that somehow miraculous?
Yeah. Well, the particular cases, just in general, I mean, there isn't a kind of deductive way from the law structure to the particular cases, even in nature or something like that. So it'd be hard to expect. I mean, there is some explanation in principle. I mean, what's happening is it's always the case that you can give priority to the moral law. In this particular context, you've not. I think he's actually got a deeper theory. I think the deeper theory is that there are no such things as these just particular exemptions. Like one day I wasn't feeling good, so didn't go with the moral imperative and whatever. I think he's got a lawful notion of human character as such. So every individual has a law. The law is, I'm going to be 63% oriented towards morality, for example. My case yours might be 36 or 37, but then the circumstances of the world just kind of fit into that, but you can't say in an a priori way, will it happen a particular day. You've got a kind of resistance factor that only goes so far. I think so in that sense it comes under laws still. So you're always acting in character for Kant. That would be my way of saying it.
So then, if that's like the full story, then it seems like the reason free action in general counts as non-miraculous is because it's governed in a lawful way by character.
Yeah, or persons in general are governed. Yeah, I mean, in the end, his theory of the person, I think, is the theory of timeless character. I mean, there's the intellectual, which stands behind the empirical character. There is the extra mystery. Why are you 36 or 37 and somebody else 63? But you always have a surge somewhere. Why are, any law that's not just an analytic law, that law. But once you got that law, everything fits it. And certainly throughout the history of your life, it'll fit that law, whatever that law is.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Sam.
Thanks. This is a fairly, basic conceptual point. I was trying to get clear on exactly what the account of miracle was that he was attacking. And it looked like there was a bit of a shift at times. So often you emphasize miracle as some kind of interventionist model, so it's a violation of a law, of a natural law, say.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's supernatural. But of course, if that's the attack, then it leaves theories of divine concursus completely untouched, because of course, theories of divine concursus are perfectly happy with natural causes being quite efficacious. They're just not sufficient.
Yeah.
In and of themselves. But other times it looked like, no, actually, there's a more literal sense of supernatural here, and that was what was being attacked. Something like any kind of sort of exceeding the natural powers of an object in any way. And so it's not so much the violation of laws, but in this sense, concursus gets kicked out. You were talking about this at the end. Concursus get kicked out with everything. Any kind of appeal to something beyond simply the state of the world at a time and the natural world at a time. And
what would you mean by one of these? Just give me an example of the powers that instead of using law
Well, you were
talk.
saying so the state of the world, according to Kant, at least in this bizarre text, the state of the world at a time is sufficient for the next state of the world, and we don't need anything like a physical concursus from God.
Right, but the laws, but the states are under laws for him. So
sure, that's right. But I took that to be a kind of broader attack rather than just an attack on miracles per se, if that's what he's ruling out. But then I didn't see why appealing to anything about laws actually ruled that out. You needed something more to get rid of concursus than just saying, well, we want a law-governed character, because you can have law-governed concursus.
Well, actually,
Branch gave you.
Yeah, I'm not really against concursus or connecting concursus with Kant. It's just, I introduced those texts rather to say that he's really into talking about that stuff. And I think it's one of those places where he says, where I take him to be saying, well, I don't need to get into that. You can add it, but then when you start adding it, where do you, why do you do in this case, not in that case? And therefore, I was just trying to, the whole idea of the section was to say, hey, what's neat here is that if you think of what he's most interested, the highest good situation, he's got like a very strong particular reason for saying we got to bring God on the scene there. But if a metaphysician wants to come along and say there might be other arguments that you haven't thought about where God has to be involved in a concursive situation, I don't think that would upset him a whole lot as long as it doesn't mess up the laws. And I don't think you were proposing there ever be any mess up with the laws. So there might be all sorts of ways he could agree with. In fact, I was most interested in that. For a long time, I really wanted to present Kant as primarily someone interested in divine concursus everywhere. But when he actually talks about this stuff, I think he just tends to back off, and I think he's allowed to back off, saying, "Well, gee, I don't know how to identify it," and so forth. So that's what's going on there. But,
So Kant would be happy maybe with lots of supernatural agency, just so long as it was in accordance with a kind of law pattern of secondary causes.
Well, I don't think it's any stranger than, again, what he's saying about human freedom. So, so it turns out a lot of things I do are just digestion. Other things are results of my free action. And that's pretty mysterious. And is that going on every second or not every second? So my general thought is once you get into Kant's metaphysics, there's all this other level of stuff that's always going on, and he tries to kind of normalize it by saying, no, there's these laws governing it. So the critical caveat at the end is, well, wait a second. Once you introduce the two levels, the phenomenal and the noumena, then are you really in a position to attack this or that theory of miracles or any other complicated theory of divine causation? It's just that sort of, in the end, it's not a refuted position, but it's not particularly better off, maybe. So I'm not unsympathetic to your worry.
Okay. My apologies to those who raised their hands, but that's our time. Lunch is prepared for us next door, the very next room. So we'll go there, and then we reconvene here at 2 o'clock, so that gives us plenty of time to unwind midday. But let's thank our speakers.
Yeah, thank you.